Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Lydia Mashburn, Chairman Ron Paul's Policy Director for his Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy. On behalf of Congressman Ron Paul and his office, I welcome you to the first in our three-part afternoon tea lecture series on the basic principles of money. Thank you for coming. Today's question, what is money, is a simple one, but a rarely asked question, and as such, not properly understood. Understanding money as a market phenomenon versus understanding it as a government phenomenon is crucial to understanding our economy in general and understanding the recent crises that we have faced in the past few years. To help us answer this question of what is money, we have joining us today Dr. Joseph Salerno, who is a professor of economics at Pace University. He is also the academic vice president for the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. And he is the author of the book, Money, Sound, and Unsound. He will speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Salerno.
Thank you, Lydia. And thanks for all being here. I mean, it's a great turnout, and I'm thrilled to be here. But as Lydia pointed out, what I want to do is to address a deceptively simple question, the question of what is money? We all use it every day. It's part of our daily lives. But if you examine it a little bit more closely, if you think about why you would accept for maybe a house that you're selling or your very valuable labor time, pieces of paper with green ink on them that the materials in which cost about 4 cents. That might puzzle you. Why would, because you have no intention to use these notes or paper tickets directly, right? You can't eat them. I mean, you can't use them for wallpaper, though this could use them maybe. And I mean, maybe a miser, like, would want to, lie in his bed at night and fondle them or something. But normal people have no direct use for these pieces of paper. Okay, so there's a lot of other questions that come up when you're talking about money. For example, why are 80% of the $100 bills that have been printed in the U.S. outside the country being used to finance drug trade or being used as a hedge against inflation by citizens of other countries with irresponsible monetary systems, things like that, which I won't address. But the basic question of why would we accept paper tickets worth very little in exchange for very valuable goods deserves an answer. So what I want to do is to give you that answer, but that answer has to be given historically. Okay, so we want to start from the beginning, and that is what occurred before there was money? I mean, if you go back to primitive times, you'll find that there were instances of barter. You won't find many of them. Okay. Even the ancient Babylonians had the first records of history talk about money. But there was a time before there was money. And that state of affairs is called barter, where people would exchange things that they intended to use directly to satisfy their wants for other things that they valued less. So I put a little model up there, and what I want to point out is that there is almost an insurmountable problem with barter, or a problem that makes it very, very costly in terms of time and resources to use barter to satisfy your wants. And that is what we call double coincidence of wants. That term, which seems forbidding at first, really just refers to the fact that, look, I may want what you have, okay? I may want that pastry that you have, okay? But you may not want my watch, okay? You may have enough watches, okay? So in this case, let's say that A is desperately in need of a pair of shoes and has eggs. So he wants what B has. But B's allergic to eggs, breaks out in hives and so on, and doesn't want to hear about eggs. Even the thought of them makes him nauseous, okay? Now, that would be the end of it. He would then have to begin to search, and especially in an area that's not densely populated, for someone else that was capable of producing shoes. But if he was ingenious and persistent, he would hit upon a solution that at first seems more complicated and less likely to achieve his ends, but in fact is much more efficient. And that is indirect exchange. A may know that everyone in that society uses salt. Okay, this is before refrigeration. So people use it to season their foods, but also to preserve their perishable meats and so on and so forth. And so he knows that there's a wide demand among people who make many different goods for salt. So what he would do then would be to take his eggs to some person C, okay, and there's a lot of C's out there, a lot of people who have salt, and find the person who would want the eggs in exchange for salt. Then he would exchange for the salt. But he himself doesn't want the salt, okay? At that moment in time, you have the emergence of indirect exchange, the first step towards money. We don't know when it happened. We don't know what individual discovered it, that way of solving the problem of barter, the double coincidence of wants. But what we do know is then A would turn around with that salt and use it in order to exchange for the shoes that he initially wanted. Others will see that A solves his problem that way, and then will begin to emulate him, okay? But the more people that use salt, the more widely, for a medium of exchange, the more widely acceptable it is, and therefore the better a medium of exchange it is. So as time goes on, salt becomes, in that society, a medium of exchange, okay? Yes, it's still used directly to satisfy certain human wants, but its main use becomes the facilitation of further exchanges. So as we'll see, then everyone is permitted to specialize because they're confident that no matter what they produce, they can always sell it for salt and then use the salt to buy all the other things they need. Another problem with barter, very quickly, is if someone has an indivisible good, a good like a dairy cow, and that person wants clothes, whiskey, shoes, and other things, well, if he cuts the cow up, the dairy cow, it loses its value. So how does he buy these different things from different people without dividing up that cow? Well, very simply, he takes a cow and he sells it for salt. Sells it for, 15 barrels of salt, and then divides the salt up among the other specialists who he wants to buy from. So these problems are then solved in that way. Let me just give you, and we know in history that many different items, useful items, were used as media of exchange, okay, which is the plural of medium of exchange, which means simply the intermediary good that people buy, not because they want it, but because they want to give it away again in the future for something more valuable, which is why we hold the dollars, okay, and we'll come back to that. Cattle were used in ancient Greece, leather in Rome, maize or corn in Mexico, wampum, strings of beads were used by the American Indians, and you've heard the story, I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not, that the Dutch purchased Manhattan Island from the Indians for $26 worth of wampum. Dried fish in the Canadian maritime colonies. Salt was used, and so was iron implements, farming implements in parts of Africa. Wives were used in ancient Egypt. Before the advent of capitalism, women were little more than chattel property, okay? So if you weren't able to watch it, if they were bothering you while you were watching a football game, you could say, well, you're going to be someone else's wife tomorrow. And finally, there were actually dried tobacco was used in colonies of Virginia. All right, so all of these things were used, but a few goods came to be used throughout the world over time, okay, because of the qualities that they embodied as media of exchange. But before I get to those goods, let me just mention that there are some modern examples, interesting modern examples of money arising in emergency situations. And some of you who have had economics, you must have heard the story of the POW camps, the German POW camps. American prisoners received rations from their German captors, as well as care packages from the Red Cross during World War II. An economist, an American economist, happened to be a captive in a POW camp, prisoner of war, and recorded all of this. And what he found was, when people got their care packages and their rations, every week or month, there were many things in those packages. It was chocolate, razor blades, socks, underwear, cigarettes, and so on. But if you've seen old World War II movies, what does everybody do? They all smoke, okay? And so what occurred, and that's, it's representative of what actually happened. Since everyone used cigarettes, eventually people who had too much chocolate and wanted razor blades but couldn't find someone with razor blades who also wanted his chocolate would begin to exchange for cigarettes. So eventually, on each barracks, there were, or each prison building, there was posted cigarette prices of the various goods and services. So money emerged, okay? And there was inflation and deflation. As the month wore on, people smoked the cigarettes, so that prices went down because there were fewer in the camp, and then when the new packages came in, they went up again. But I found another interesting example in Iraq. There was an article by a former Marine who did a 7-month stint in Iraq, and he was posted in a number of different farming villages. And a lot of wealth had been destroyed, real wealth, houses, cars, trucks, so on, fishing boats. And the people of the villages, rightly so, didn't put much trust in the money that was being issued, paper money that was being issued by Baghdad. And so what they did was, they all owned sheep. Whether you were affluent, if you were affluent, you would have a huge herd of sheep. But even the poorer families had some sheep. And so what began to happen was people began to exchange sheep for other goods and services and write their contracts in sheep and repay debts in sheep. But sheep are big and very valuable in that sort of an economy. So a second good began to emerge alongside the sheep. And these villages were located near the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River, the water in the Euphrates River was suitable for watering their crops and for the sheep, but not for human consumption. So water from the cities was generally purchased and came in big trucks. People began to, for smaller purchases, use water because everyone drank water, especially in the summer. Okay? And then finally, cigarettes were usually smoked at night with chai tea by the villagers. And so cigarettes were in circulation. So we had 3 parallel monies. Okay? And the paper money wasn't used at all. Okay? And this was in 2007 that this occurred. Okay? So those are some examples. All right, so as trade with different regions and countries began to develop, as small groups began to trade with other small groups, and we began to get a network of interregional and even international trade during the Middle Ages, a few goods emerged as the general media of exchange. We talk about the general medium of exchange, we mean that good which is universally and routinely accepted by everyone without giving it a second thought. And right now, the Federal Reserve note is such a good. We don't think twice about accepting Federal Reserve notes or claims on Federal Reserve notes, which is bank deposits, in exchange for all the goods we sell and for the labor that we sell to our employers. Okay? So it's a medium of exchange in that sense, when people do not even think twice about it, but simply accept it and pass it on. And the question I asked in the beginning can be answered by pointing out that the reason why you accept these pieces of paper is because they have a pre-existing purchasing power. You know that people are willing to accept them at certain prices for different things, so that you accept them and then you pass them on. That happened with gold and silver. Okay? So over centuries, an evolutionary process took place in which gold and silver, and to some extent copper, outcompeted all of the other media, local media of exchange, so that they became the world money. Now let me just very quickly talk about the qualities of a good medium of exchange. First of all, as you saw in the Iraq example, they have to be generally acceptable. They have to be widely used in that society. That's the first quality. It's extremely important. Gold and silver were used in almost all societies and cultures as religious rituals, for ornamentation, as jewelry, to embroider the dresses and suits of the nobility. So everyone accepted them. But second, they were also highly durable. Okay, remember, when you accept a medium of exchange, you don't want it to deteriorate overnight. That's why cigarettes, for example, aren't a good medium of exchange, because they're used up in their natural function. Because you want to hold them until you find attractive opportunities on which you want to spend the gold coins or the silver coins. So just keep in mind that almost all the gold that was mined when, let's say, Jesus of Nazareth walk the earth is still in existence today. Even if you go back to being recorded history, almost all the gold and silver ever mined are in existence today, except that which has been lost by fire. Gold can be melted and can be lost in a fire or sunk in ships. Right? So gold is extremely durable. Well, but if that's so, why isn't iron a good medium of exchange? Iron did serve as a medium of exchange for a while, but was outcompeted. It's enormously durable, very highly durable. Well, there's a third characteristic that's very important, and that is that it must be portable, easy to carry. Now, you would say, well, a ton of iron is just as easy to, or an ounce of iron is just as easy to carry as an ounce of gold. But the key is the good must have a high value to weight ratio. Okay? So if you wanted to buy a lawnmower at Sears or at Walmart or something that cost $300, had a price of $300, you would have to bring, just a very small amount of gold. Okay, let's see, so at 60, maybe a fifth of an ounce of gold, but you'd have to bring in a ton of iron. Okay, so iron wasn't very portable because it had a very low value to weight ratio, so it was outcompeted. Also must be highly divisible. That is, you can divide up pieces of gold into very small pieces without them losing any of their value. You cannot do that, for example, with precious gems, which were used as a medium of exchange. Okay, if you break up a diamond, it loses its value. Okay, into small pieces. So that's why precious gems were outcompeted. And then every unit must be the same as every other unit, identical to the other unit. So every ounce of gold ever mined is exactly the same in all its physical properties as every other ounce of gold, which we call homogeneous. That's not true of diamonds. In fact, diamonds are precisely desired, especially for engagements and so on, because no diamond is like any other diamond. Just as no two snowflakes are exactly the same. Okay, so when something's exactly the same, then it's easy to recognize the value of it. Whereas since each diamond is different, the value would have to be appraised at each purchase, and it would be highly expensive. And finally, it has to be easily recognizable. In those old cowboy movies, and I'm not talking about Cowboys and Aliens, but the older westerns, you saw when a gold coin was passed in the Old West, you would see a cowboy biting down onto it. Well, the gold leaves teeth marks because it's malleable. It's easy to work with. Whereas fool's gold, which looks very much like gold, I don't know what chemical element it is, but it looks very much like gold, is very hard. So there were easy tests. There's some chemical tests that allowed you to quickly and inexpensively find out if you were dealing with a counterfeit or not. Okay. So the bottom line in all this is that money was not invented. It was not invented. It wasn't created by the state. There wasn't some wise old benevolent king that said, my people are suffering from a lack of coincidence of wants, and therefore I must get all my wise men together and solve this problem. And then they would get together and say, yes, we have to use salt or something like that. That's nonsense. That's not the way it happened. Nor was there a big town meeting in which let's say all the Virginia colonists got together in a town meeting and made a contract that we'll all accept tobacco leaves, dried tobacco leaves, as money. It's not the way it happened either. Okay? It happened as a result of a market process which was embodied the actions of millions of people over time, all seeking their own benefit, all seeking to solve the problems of indivisibility and coincidence of wants. And in doing so, motivating others to follow their example, so that over time, money arose on the market. Government had nothing to do with it. Okay? It stepped in much later and actually distorted the monetary system later on. Let me mention one other thing here, and that is, could money come into existence as a paper fiat currency? Fiat meaning issued by the state. Fiat's the Latin word for this must be, or this is my will, okay, you will use this paper. No, it couldn't. And the reason why it couldn't is because if you issued a piece of paper, let's say you trusted me completely, okay? You knew me, you trusted me. despite the fact that I'm from New Jersey and my name ends in a vowel, you still thought I was very trustworthy. Okay, so I came to you and I said, look, here's 10 Salernos. Can I have your pen or can I have your watch? Well, even if you trust me, you wouldn't accept it because what the hell is it worth? There's no past history, okay? But with gold, silver, salt, iron, there's a past history. There's barter. They were exchanging for other things on the barter. So you had an idea of what they were worth. And that's why money must come into existence as a useful market commodity and cannot be imposed from without by the state. Okay. Now, let me just mention some of the benefits of money. First of all, and very importantly, it serves as a unit of pricing. Okay. It allows you to compare prices against one another, and also as a unit of economic calculation. It allows businesses to calculate their revenues, costs, profits, and losses. In a barter economy, let's say there were only 1,000 goods. That means there would be 499,500 prices to keep track of, because each good has 999 other prices, because each good potentially can be exchanged for any of the other 999 goods. In a money economy, money is always one half of every transaction. So if there are 1,000 goods, there's 1,000 prices. There's not 499,000 prices. Now, that's just 1,000 goods. The average supermarket in the US today has 27,000 items. So there's millions and millions and millions of different barter prices for those goods if they were exchanged against one another. There would be no way to have a supermarket, okay, under barter. Also under barter, there's very little specialization. That is, people specializing in those things in which they are most productive, which is what raises our standard of living and the productivity of labor so greatly. And the reason is the following. Let's say I'm an economics professor, and I want, let's say, a Wall Street Journal. Well, how do I get it? Under barter. Okay? There is no money, so I can't sell my services for money. I have to go to the guy and give him a 10-minute economics lecture or something like that, which he probably doesn't want to hear, so he wouldn't give me the Wall Street Journal anyway. Okay? Or if I want breakfast, something similar, I have to stand there and talk to the waitress or whatever. So you see the problem. Okay? And there's a third problem. The third problem that money solves is that you can't produce large, durable consumer goods or capital goods, because how's the entrepreneur, the employer, going to pay the workers? Let's say you're producing cars. I mean, are you going to pay the workers in cars? Are you going to break up the cars and try to pay them every 2 weeks or something like that? That's impossible. Or if you're producing something that's not even a consumer's good, like oil or steel, are you going to give them 10 pounds of steel or a barrel of oil? They don't want that. So you would have a very primitive economy under barter, and money solves that problem. Okay? Now, again, no one set out to solve all of those problems. No one set out to invent money. Okay? It, again, happened as a result of the interaction of hundreds of millions over time of individual human minds. So what is the monetary unit? Okay? Well, since money comes into existence as a commodity, as a useful commodity, most commodities circulate by weight or by volume, ounces of gold, okay, pounds of silver, barrels of salt. Well, money circulates by weight. That is, the unit of money is a unit of weight of a specific commodity. And even when the gold standard in the 19th century came into existence, and by then we had names for different national currencies, it was still a unit of weight. Let me just take three different currencies. The French franc, the British pound, and the American dollar. They actually were simply names for units of weight. And let me just give you an example of that. Okay, let's just stick with the pound and the dollar. For about 100 years, the dollar was legally defined as about 1/20th of an ounce of gold. That's an approximation, okay? And the British pound was defined from 1821 to 1931, when Britain went off the gold standard, as 1/4 of an ounce of gold. They weren't different monies. They were the same money. Now, the exchange rate for all of the 19th century, now we used to exchange rates, I was in Austria, so I was continuously watching the exchange rates between the euro and the dollar last week to make the most advantageous exchange of my euros for dollars and back to dollars and so on. And it was changing all the time, every day. But for 100 years, it was stable. The exchange rate between dollars and pounds was approximately $4.86 per pound. Some people say that under the gold standard, many economists say that under the gold standard we had fixed exchange rates. But an exchange rate is a price between two different things. The pound and the dollar in the 19th century were not two different things. They were different weights of the same thing. So it's wrong to say that that's an exchange rate. That's determined not by the laws of economics, but by the laws of arithmetic. Okay? In the same way that the exchange rate between a quarter and nickels is 5-to-1. Because a quarter is defined as 1/4 or 0.25 or 25 cents of a dollar, and a nickel is defined as 1/20 or 5 cents of a dollar. Okay? So, since the quarter refers to 5 times more of a dollar than does a nickel, 5 nickels exchanged for a dollar. Well, for a quarter. Well, the same is true here. Okay? The pound had approximately 5 times the amount of gold that in it, okay, that it was defined as, and therefore was 5 times more valuable than the dollar. That's not true today. All national currencies are different things now because they're issued by different monopolists, different monopoly central banks. What was the money supply under this what we call a commodity standard? Money developed as a commodity, as a useful commodity. So we called it commodity money. Today we call money fiat money because it's a piece of paper, or it could even be this bottle. The government or the U.S. central bank, as a legal monopolist that can print money, can put in the space here $10 or $20, and it would be legal tender. It can use this eraser, it can use my shirt, it can use anything. It's not necessary to use paper. But under commodity standard, there was one thing that was the commodity, that was the money, and that was the physical commodity itself. Okay? So the money supply was the total quantity of the commodity that was in monetary form. The total amount of gold in the country that was in the form of bars, which is called bullion, and coins. Or even gold dust was used in Western towns. Or gold nuggets. So all of those things constituted the money supply. So let me just talk a few minutes before I end about how did the money supply behave under commodity money? Did we have inflation? Did we have deflation? Well, in the case of gold, the only time the money supply increased was when new gold mines, when gold was mined. Okay, so it increased very slowly over time. Every once in a while, it would jump because new sources of gold was discovered in Australia in the 1870s, in California, 1849, in South Africa in 1896, and so on. Or when a new improved technology for extracting gold was developed. Okay, so there was very little inflation. In fact, there wasn't inflation. There was a fall of prices. Since gold increased very slowly and the money supply increased very slowly, the increase in goods and services, okay, real wealth, was faster. And so as a result, what happened was, as the supplies of goods and services shifted out, there was an increase in the supply of these things in relation to money, and money is what lies behind the demand for these things, prices actually fell. Okay. So to take an example, even though the money supply is being increased very rapidly, and has been increased very rapidly since World War II, we still found that if goods and services in certain sectors of our economy increase more rapidly than the money supply, prices are going to fall, and we're all going to benefit from those falling prices. So take the example of computers. A mainframe computer produced by IBM in the 70s cost about $3 million. And a personal computer today costs $500. The personal computer is faster and has more memory. Okay? So we've had tremendous drop in prices. Now, did this deflation cause any sort of problems in the computer industry? fact, no. In 1980, there was about 500,000 personal computers shipped. By 1999, 20 years later, despite the fact that prices had come down from 20,000 to less than 1,000 for personal computers, you had 11 million, or 22 times the amount of computers shipped. So falling prices, when they occur naturally on the market as a result of goods and services being increased due to changes in technology, improvements in technology, and in capital that raises labor productivity, brings about a very benign or benign, what we call growth deflation. Okay? So that's actually what happened in the 19th century. So just to end up with just a few of the statistics, very simple. In 1800, a dollar that was $1 in 1800, it only took about 79 cents to purchase what a dollar in 1800 could buy. By 1913, 113 years later, the value of money had gone up about 27%. In other words, what you could buy in 1800 for a dollar, it only cost you 79 cents to buy in 1913. What you could buy in 1913, this is after the Fed came into existence, for a dollar, doesn't cost you less, it costs you much more. It costs you $22 today. So, under the commodity standard, the value of the gold dollar went up by about 27% because prices fell very gently. Under the fiat standard that's controlled by a central bank, the Federal Reserve System, the value of the dollar has shrunk to about a nickel of what it was worth in 1913 when the Fed was established. Okay. So basically what you got for all countries on the gold standard during the 19th century was a very slow decline in prices, which meant that all the fruits of improved technology, of increased investments in machines and other labor productivity increasing type investments, all of those things were spread to the whole population. Whether your salary was going up or not in money terms, because prices were going down, as they have with computers, your dollar became more powerful. Okay. So if you go back to a commodity standard, you'll find that over time, the value of money would rise. So under the gold standard, eventually the governments, I didn't get into this, because hopefully that will be covered. The governments began to get involved. They took over monopolies of the mints, and then they debased the coins. They made them lower and lower in weight. The kings would call back the coins to recoin them, and then they would, if it was 1 full ounce, let's say King Nitwit was the king of some realm, and so the first thing he would do is put a name on the coin, and his face, when he took over the mint. And he would charge people a lot of money to get their gold mint into coins. That's called seigniorage. So that monopoly price for getting your gold coined. So in any case, what would happen then is, every once in a while the coins would get worn, or a new king would come in and want to put his face on it, so they call the coinage back. So instead of giving you a full ounce of gold back, they would only give you 0.8 of an ounce of gold. And they would put the same name on it, 1 nit. So what they would do is, in effect, increase the money supply by 20%, because they would keep that 20% that they stole from the people who were turning in their gold coins and mint them into their own coins so they could pay for their more palaces, wars, mistresses, and so on. Over time, after the printing press was discovered, they found that an easier way of creating money that was less costly was simply to print paper, set up a central bank, and the first central bank that was set up in that fashion was the Bank of England in 1694. Get the bank to loan them money to pay for the wars and so on, and then the bank would promise to pay back the notes that the king spent in gold. And so people got used to paper money over time. We still had a gold standard, but to get to your question, by the 19th century, it wasn't a pure commodity standard anymore. So the central banks would keep maybe 20, 30, or 40% of the notes that they issued in the form of gold. And then you had private banks beginning to start, and they would hold not gold itself, or they'd hold very little gold, but they'd hold the notes of the central bank. So eventually all of the gold, which backed up the money, became centralized in the central bank. So maybe you had 10% backing up. Let's say there was $10 million in the economy. There was only $1 million worth of gold in the central bank. So that if everyone came and demanded gold, or even a significant proportion of the population, because they didn't trust the paper money, the whole system would collapse literally like a house of cards. Okay? So there were problems under even the gold standard because the banks could create paper money and lend it out, pushing the interest rate down and causing inflation to occur. And at that point, when prices went up, people began to buy goods from other countries where the prices were lower. But other countries didn't want the paper, they wanted gold. So at least under the gold standard, the central banks would start to lose gold as people turned in their dollars to pay for their imports from China and so on. At that point, everyone would begin to get fearful that they wouldn't get their gold back, so the central banks had to stop inflating. So the gold standard was called the golden handcuffs, because if the banks got too inflationary, gold would start to flow out. People would see that, the clients of the banks who deposit their money would see that, and they would begin to get nervous, and then that would increase the outflow of gold because people would rush to the banks. So to prevent that from happening, they always nipped the inflation in the bud. So after 1933, we went off the gold standard. Almost every country did. They tried to reconstruct it after World War II in 1946. It was called the Bretton Woods system. It was a brainchild of John Maynard Keynes and of Harry Dexter White, who turned out to be a Soviet spy. He worked for the US Treasury, and that system was a phony gold standard. Normal people like you or I or our grandparents and parents could not redeem their dollars for gold at the stated price of $35 per ounce. Only the foreign central banks and governments could do that. But the U.S. continued to inflate to pay for the Vietnam War, and then also for the war on poverty under President Johnson. And as a result of that, we began to lose a lot of gold to the rest of the world. Initially, people were willing to hold U.S. dollars because we had most of the gold at the end of World War II. And since our own people couldn't get hold of that gold, they couldn't convert their dollars, the rest of the world said, you know what, there's more than enough gold to accommodate all the outstanding dollars. But we caused the Fed to pay for government deficits, created so much money during the 60s that towards the end of the 60s, I think there was something like $12 billion worth of gold that we had, and foreigners held $80 billion. So that's when the French, under de Gaulle, and the Germans wanted to convert their dollars en masse into gold. And we basically blackmailed the Germans and tried to blackmail the French by saying, you know, we have to remove our nuclear umbrella. We'd have to stop protecting you against the Soviet Union if you do this. It's going to cost us a lot of money. In any case, the Germans backed off. The French dropped out of NATO. And at the end of the whole story, we still were losing gold like crazy. So by 1971, we had about 2 weeks left of gold. And so President Nixon then, it's 40 years this past August, right? Yeah. Stepped to the podium and said, he's closing the gold window. So we reneged on a solemn pledge to the rest of the world that we made in 1946. And the whole thing collapsed. From 71 on, there was an enormous inflation because now there was no more danger at all of losing any gold. Yeah.
Would you recommend going back to a gold standard or some kind of commodity-based standard? And if so, how would you accomplish that?
The answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is that it's very, very difficult. But I think you could accomplish the first few steps in that direction. A few of the things that you could do is to allow people to buy and sell gold without any capital gains taxes, without any sales taxes, excise taxes, remove all the taxes on gold and silver so that now people could use them if they wanted as a parallel currency. At the same time, allow people to hold euro deposits in American banks and Swiss franc deposits. So then the American government would have to be looking at the fact that the deposits of dollar deposits are losing popularity vis-a-vis these other alternative monies. So that's one way that you could begin to go back in that direction. And in the meantime, stop the inflation.
But what about repealing legal tender laws?
Yeah, I bet you're absolutely right. And repeal legal tender laws. So people could make their contracts in gold, silver, and they would have to pay them in gold and silver. Because legal tender allows you to pay any debt you owe in paper money. Okay, it forces the creditor to accept the paper money. Yes?
Just expanding off what he just
Yeah.
said, it actually seems to be the most common objection to going back to the gold standard is that there's just not enough in the world today.
Right.
So is that actually true?
Well, remember that There's not enough of anything in the world to satisfy all the human wants for it. That's why we have prices for things. So if the price is under the Soviet Union at the end, even a simple item like toilet paper was in short supply. If you saw the movie Moscow on the Hudson, people were lining up to get toilet paper because the prices were kept so low. Well, the same thing is true with gold. At some price of gold, there'll be enough to back the dollars and so on. And also, I think silver would be used in smaller transactions. Yes?
So you were saying basically commodity money often goes up in value, becomes more valuable, that's deflation, and fiat money becomes less valuable through inflation.
Yes.
How come a lot of talking heads blame the Japanese recession of the 80s and 90s on deflation?
Because they're confusing depression with deflation. If you look at it, there is a little deflation in the Japanese economy, but the money supply was almost always increasing. Okay, so you really can't have a deflation without a fall in the money supply, unless there's a big increase in the demand for money, that people are frightened of the future and want to hold it, which happened here in the U.S. in 2008 during the financial crisis. So even though the money supply was going up, the demand to hold the money and not spend it was going up by more. So that can cause prices to fall, but that only happens during crisis situations. And so for the most part, Japan did what all the American economists were urging them to do. They ran big deficits and they increased the money supply. But they are a very productive economy, so they never really had much of a recession. They had what's called a growth recession. The rate of growth went down. Their economy shrunk only for a few quarters. Okay, so I would say that the main problem with Japan is the fact that its labor markets are extremely rigid. Its business organizations are tied into government and aren't flexible. And there was actually a very good article about all of this very recently, and I can't remember what newspaper in fact, I gave it to my class a few days ago, and it had to do with the fact that Japanese companies are looking down on this new startup firm, or this new firm, I think it's called Uniqlo, which is selling a lot of clothing throughout the world, like a low-tech product, and that's sort of looked down on in Japan, and people are dismissing it. But the guy who owns it, Yanei, is the second wealthiest man in Japan now. And he's broken the whole Japanese model. He's hired foreigners, and he's poaching. He's going to other companies trying to bid away good talent, which isn't done. Okay, so I think it's the rigidity in the Japanese economy that has a lot of government intervention that really caused that recession. Okay, China had falling prices for a long time, and they were growing like crazy. So but they, because they were very, very entrepreneurial. Yes.
Is there a lot of money that's already been printed that they're holding to still release into the economy? And what would happen if we do start to repatriate money, lower capital gains, decrease regulations, and start encouraging the money that's being held also flow into the economy? What happens when it comes from both directions?
Okay, you're asking a good question. The first part of that question is that the Fed has increased what's called the monetary base, that is the reserves of the bank and currency. And the banks, because of the bad business climate, aren't lending them out to the extent that they could lend those reserves out. Okay, they're holding what's called excess reserves. They're allowed to lend out 90% of all their deposits, but they're not doing that. Okay, so you're right. If things pick up and that money is lent out, and also, by the way, they're discouraged from lending it out by the fact that the Fed is paying them 0.25% on holding that money at the Fed rather than lending it. Okay, so that could cause an enormous inflation. But what the Fed could do to offset that is try to begin to sell off some of its assets that it has purchased in the mortgage-backed securities and so on, and begin to absorb those extra dollars from the banking system. Because when it sells things to the banking system, the banks have to pay with their own reserves. So that's a question, of what the Fed will do, and I think they'll try to prevent that sort of an inflation. The other part of your question is people themselves holding money, investors, and not investing, because they're fearful of the costs of potential costs of Obamacare, what's going to happen to taxes as a result of the $1 trillion deficits we keep racking up, and all of those questions. That kind of spending is good for the economy. In other words, then people will begin to take risks to invest in actually producing goods and services. And that will actually cause prices to fall, all other things equal. Yes?
Milton Friedman blamed the lack of action by the Federal Reserve as one of the causes of the Great Depression.
Yes.
If we went back, if we took away the Fed's ability to expand the money supply, how would we have gotten out of the Great Depression?
If we had taken it away before that, we would have never had a Great Depression. So no, I don't mean to be flip, but the point is that during the 1920s, the Fed expanded the money supply at between 6 and 7% per year. And it didn't show, see, all American economists believe that the true indicator of inflation was consumer prices, okay? Whereas the Austrian economists who observed America and who came to America, such as Hayek, the Nobel Prize winner, and Mises in Austria, they pointed out that the American economy was growing tremendously during the 1920s. Okay, we had electricity now coming into general use, refrigeration was being developed, cars were being mass-produced after World War I, so there was tremendous industrial activity. Prices should have actually fallen a great deal every year, but prices didn't change. Between 21 and 28, prices stayed about the same, when they should have come down tremendously. What caused them to stay up? The inflation. The Fed was inflating the money supply. The money was being lent out by the banks, pushing interest rates down, causing people to speculate in the stock market, drive up real estate prices. So my response to Friedman would be that had they not had that power, prices would have naturally fallen as they did during the 1880s and 1890s, and we wouldn't have had a crash that led to the Depression. And for the reason why it was extended, and this will be talked about in another lecture, is because there was a lot of legislation that prevented prices and wages from falling to meet the fact that people didn't want to spend during the Depression. They were afraid of the future. So yes, there was a deflationary pressure. But if the Fed tried to stop that, they would simply reproduce the problem. So that would be my response. I mean, whether or not, it's a very short time period to give you that, but there's a lot more to be said. Yes?
It seems like surely there are some times when monetary policy would be necessary. Maybe where, we did things right, for example, and then we still get into a new depression, recession, or something like that. What do you propose we do then if we don't have access to all of those tools?
See, again, that's a good question, and I'm not sure how much that confuses depression with deflation. Okay, if a depression occurs, it means that the relationship between prices are wrong. That is, costs are too high in relation to selling prices, so businesses don't want to invest. So by holding up wages and holding up a price of agricultural commodities and so on during the Great Depression, the New Deal prevented the reestablishment of profitable margins. So let's put it this way, anything that monetary policy can do, and you're right, maybe in the short run, if you injected money into the economy, you could push prices up so that businessmen believed that there was profit to be made. But a better way of doing it, that's only a short run solution, because then the costs catch up again. The better approach, the better solution to that is the microeconomic solution. Getting rid of all government legislation, such as special privileges to labor unions, minimum wage laws, price supports for foreign products that keep costs up.
You said that computers were so much cheaper right now. So are you saying that they should be even cheaper than that?
Yeah, I would love them to go down to a nickel. No, I'm serious.
But theoretically, if we were still under the gold standard.
Yeah, prices. Yeah, sure. Price of a car. It's a very good question. Price of a car was $350 in 1915 or 1916, right? If they sort of be mass produced. And maybe they should be that much or a little bit less or whatever. Prices would be going down, sure. In other words, the actual absolute price doesn't matter. It's always the relationships between prices. If your salary doubled tomorrow, but prices tripled, you'd be worse off, not better off, right? But if your salary fell by 10% and prices fell by 15%, you'd be better off. So people have to get away from this illusion of just looking at what's happening to the actual height of these nominal prices. It's always the relationships between prices.
Yeah, I think you're trying to talk about it, but I'm missing what you're saying.
Yeah.
At one point, do the falling prices become an issue for the producer? We see that with agriculture today.
Right.
Sometimes like potatoes and those they produce so much of it that they almost become, you can't make a living on producing it anymore.
Okay, there's two parts two answers to that question. That's a good question. The first part is that in industries that are growing, like computers, their costs are coming down faster than the prices are dropping. That's why the computer industry is expanding even though prices are dropping. Okay, so there are industries like that you don't have to worry about. As long as costs are falling, no matter how far prices fall, as long as costs are falling too, and they're producing more because it's now more profitable, you're going to have growth. The problem comes, let's say, with farmers. There are too many farmers. In other words, we are supporting inefficient farming because what happens is that as there's farming technology develops, some of the smaller farms are unable to take advantage of that and would go out of business normally as prices come down. Okay? We don't let that happen with all our farm subsidies and so on. So that's a market adjustment that needs to happen. We used to have, 200 years ago, maybe 97% of the labor force worked on farming, and we could barely feed the whole United States. Do you know how many people or what proportion is involved in farming today? 1.5%. So all those jobs went elsewhere, and that's fine because farming labor is so much more productive today because of capital investment, technological improvement, and so on. But that doesn't mean that in some cases you're going to have firms going out of business as a result of these low prices. Okay? But if those prices are manipulated anyway, then that's giving a signal that, look, we have too many farming goods and not enough of other goods.
So if we didn't have these farming subsidies, there would be no need for a price floor because naturally there would be less farmers producing less prices.
Right. In other words, the prices would, you're right, the more efficient farms would expand as these other farms went out of business.
In terms of if the prices for computers could drop to, say, I don't know, maybe $200 a computer.
Right.
But right now, they're able to and making a decent amount of money charging, say,
Sure.
$1,000 a computer. Why wouldn't they simply charge still $1,000 a computer because they could get enough people to buy them?
Competition. Because the other guy's going to, a ballpoint pen when it first was introduced in 1946 sold for $25. Now in today's world, that's $200 or something, like 8 times as much. People would leave them out on their coffee tables just as, as you would leave a BMW just to show that you were affluent. Within 2 years, that price went from $25 to 18 cents or something like that. And the cost had come down to like 10 cents. Because of the fierce competition. You can prevent that from happening if you allow patents and crap and stuff like that. But otherwise you're just going to have, and that's what you had with computers.
But why wouldn't that competition, occur now as well? Why wouldn't someone...
It is occurring.
That much? But why aren't prices lower then?
Because they're as low as costs will permit them to be. Look, if anyone can enter, and no one is entering, it means that there's some sort of equilibrium, right? That rate of return is what everyone is satisfied with. Okay? But now if somebody finds an even cheaper way of making it so that they can increase the return to themselves, they'll enter and they'll sell at a slightly lower price, and then the others will have to adopt that new technology or go out of business. Okay? Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. This is the first, again, in our 3-part series. The next one will be occurring in October. The third one will be in November. October's lecture will be on what is constitutional money. We will be looking at how the Constitution looks at a dollar and what those ramifications are for the economy. And then in November, we will be discussing what is it about money that causes economic crises. How did we get into this financial mess that we're in now? So I hope you will join us for that. Details will be coming shortly. And thank you again for coming. And please, let's give another round of applause for Dr. Salerno.